We're like to welcome Richard Brooks. He will be speaking on best practices for software supply chain risk assessment. So without further ado, looks like you're on. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, well, thank you all for hanging in there. I know this is, I'm the only thing between you and your the rest of your weekend, so I'll try to just get you through this, and hopefully you'll find something useful in this talk. My name is Dick Brooks. I work quite a bit in the energy industry, mostly developing energy industry standards for cybersecurity, secure messaging, and other standards used by the electric and gas industries. This talk that I'm doing here was actually presented in one of the energy watering holes called Energy Central, and they've been gracious enough to authorize me to show this presentation to you. So I'm just going to go right along and move down the pipe. Do you see a screen now that shows GlobalSign?
Yeah, I see that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so GlobalSign was the original sponsor of this talk on Energy Central. I just want to recognize them in this case. So today what I want to do is take you down through some software supply chain risks and threats. We'll talk specifically about risks that exist. We'll talk about value at risk. We'll talk about risk assessment steps. The energy industry has a set of security standards developed by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. These are called Critical Infrastructure Protection Standards. And what I'm going to show you here today is effectively designed to address those standards and go beyond by adopting some of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework functionality or capabilities that was not spelled out in the NERC standards. So this goes beyond what NERC requires, but I think it's a more appropriate, a more comprehensive risk assessment than what you would get if you only use the NERC standard. And okay, let's go. So what's the definition of risk? I think everyone on this call is already well aware of what risk is, and I just use this definition from the Department of Defense. And risk is the likelihood times the consequence of a future cause, which if you eliminated it would prevent a potential consequence from occurring. So the risk matrix that you see down below with likelihood and consequence is intended to help you identify those areas of highest risk that you need to focus on. And threats, what is the definition of threats? So these are real tactics, techniques, and procedures that are proven to successfully carry out a cyber attack. If you're familiar with the MITRE attack framework, they use these techniques, tactics, and procedures to describe behavioral attacks. But these are by parties, these are threats by parties at various skill levels with the intent, capability, and opportunity to do so, to carry out an attack. Some threats are known, some are not. You're probably very familiar with zero-day exploits. We also know that the Center for Internet Security maintains a threat level on what's occurring over the internet at any given moment, and they try to make people aware of what threat level we are operating at, so that you can take appropriate mitigating measures. So I want to provide a little bit of context. So you see what I've shown here is the NIST Cybersecurity identification for the risk assessments of 5. And you'll see that it refers to threats, vulnerabilities, likelihoods, and impacts are used to determine risk. And those are key concepts. Those are 4 key concepts. And I'd like to add a couple more, which I was very fortunate to receive from a colleague, Sinclair Colomai. He works at Honeywell as an ICS engineer, very talented fellow. But he says that a threat actor carrying out a threat action by exploiting a vulnerability resulting in a consequence that causes an impact in the production process. And so the key concept here is that the higher the risk, the lower the trust. So increased risks negatively impact trustworthiness. And trustworthiness is what I try to focus on with the best practices for software supply chain risk assessments. Now, these concepts can all blend together. So I want to try to give you a metaphor or an analogy that can help put these concepts into some context that you can relate to. So I'd like you to imagine that you're driving down the road. It's a beautiful Sunday. Weather's perfect. Everything's great. And you're driving down the road in your car. And as we all know, cars have vulnerabilities. Whenever you're driving, there's a chance that something can go wrong. And so as you're driving down the street, from a side street in front of you pulls out a truck loaded with construction waste. And this thing is spewing stuff all over the street. And lucky you, you end up having a big old nail right in the road, right in front of you, right in front of your passenger side right tire. So the nail in this case represents the threat. The vulnerability is the tire, which is vulnerable to lose its air. We look at the likelihood, and right now that you're driving down the road right at that nail, so the likelihood is very high. And then we want to talk about the potential impacts and consequences here. So the consequence that you face in driving down the road is that you will encounter that threat action. The vulnerability will be exercised or occur, and that will result in a consequence, which is a flat tire. So there you see how the threat and the vulnerability and the likelihood and impact all come together through a combination of threat actions and consequences and vulnerabilities to create a situation that needs to be mitigated ultimately. But more importantly, what this situation does, it also has an impact. And impact is really key because that's where the value at risk lies. So in the simplest case of the analogy, you get a flat tire, you pull over to the side, you replace a flat tire, one tire lost, total value at risk in that case is, maybe a couple $100. But it could be much worse. You could be driving down the road and the tire goes flat and you lose control and you roll down a cliff and now you have a vehicle that is completely totaled. And so the impact in that case is much greater. So the threats didn't change, the vulnerabilities, the likelihoods didn't change, but the impact certainly can change based on the various outcomes that you can experience as a result of that threat being carried out. And guys, I can't see the chat. Unfortunately, the way this is working on my machine. So if you're asking questions, I would ask someone to vocalize them for me. Okay, so the software supply chain risks. These are the risks that exist when you acquire a software object via the internet. So, some of the risks that are there, like spoofed download sites, watering holes, man-in-the-middle attacks, open source binary distributions, fakes. Equifax, which had a well-known data breach, blamed its breach on a flaw in outside software it was using. It then blamed a malicious download link on its website to yet another vendor. So this is just one, some of the examples of the risks that you take when you pull software off of the internet. There are also software supplier risks. Some third-party software is embedded in vendor offerings, and there can be some open source software. In fact, most software today has some component, open source components in it. And these also represent a certain element of risk as well. A software vendor may not even be aware that they've been hacked and they're distributing tainted software to their customers. This happened in the case of ASUS. And also, you'll see in the Sophos threat report, they identify similar cases where a vendor was hacked and they weren't aware of it, and they ended up distributing some malware. And speaking of malware, I really like this framework that Hacker Combat created because it shows that malware is not just one thing. It can be one of any number of things like viruses, Trojans, worms, spyware, rootkits, adware, exploit kits, and one that's getting a tremendous amount of attention today is ransomware. It seems like it is the darling of the black hat community right now from a malware standpoint. It's definitely earning some people some money. So NERC, which is as I said, this is the organization that's responsible for notifying the electricity sector of any risks that may exist. They will occasionally send out alerts, and back in July, they issued an alert on supply chain risks within the energy industry. And the energy industry is frequently under attack. It's one of those cases where it's foundational. If you can take out the power, then you can carry out a number of other attacks because so much depends on having electricity to power the systems, whether it's sensors or access control devices, whatever it may be. Many of these obviously depend on electricity. So it is one of the most commonly attacked areas in the critical infrastructure. As I said, ransomware is now your biggest online security nightmare, and I do think it's about to get worse. You can see that's a ZDNet article that I referred to from July. This was a report. In fact, it's a very fine report by the Atlantic Council. Trey Herr and his folks over there did a really good job at producing an analysis of some of the supply chain risks. And as you can see, they identified 115 attacks and disclosures against the software supply chain just in the past decade. So you see, I provide a link there to the Atlantic Council and Trey's research study. It's very well done, and it's worth the time to read. So looking at some key trends, these were what was identified in that Atlantic Council report. There's a deep impact from state actors. There are at least 27 different state attacks against the software supply chain. Abusing trust in code signing. This is a absolute big problem because there's a tendency for people to believe that a signed software object is trustworthy. And I assure you that is definitely not the case, but there are some people who rely on some of these signing certificates to establish trust. Authenticode is one that is typically abused. Hijacking software updates. 27% of the attacks targeted software updates to insert malicious code. Poisoning of open source, also another popular attack vector, and targeting app stores. 22% of the attacks targeted app stores like Google Play and Apple's App Store and so forth. I'm not really going to spend much time on the CIP requirements here because I suspect most folks aren't from the energy industry, but suffice it to say that there are standards that require electric companies and any party that is in a command and control position within the bulk electric system to verify the identity and integrity of a software object before making any change to a baseline system. And that's one of the key processes or procedural controls that require users to obtain their software directly from the developer or vendors' preferred delivery methods. So some of the guidance that was seen as part of that overall effort suggested that a digitally signed software object could be trusted, and I think that it takes a bit more than just verifying a signature to confirm that you have a safe object to install. There are a few more steps, and I'll get to those in just a moment. Here again, this is more information. The energy industry, the regulators are pushing the electric industry to adopt more secure controls in the software supply chain. And so FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has been nudging the industry toward using the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which I also endorse as part of my best practices as well. So one of the difficult problems or challenges is when you start doing these risk assessments with software and supply chains is how to determine or establish trust. So you need to evaluate risk and establish trust. And what these practices recommend is that you apply a triangulating approach to corroborating evidence. So don't rely on one data point to convince you that you can trust a software object. You really need to corroborate evidence across a number of inputs, input channels. So vendor supplied data is a key input. Software bill of materials, which I'm going to get to in a little bit, and digital signatures, of course, that all have to corroborate. And ground truth, vulnerabilities. You want to ensure that the data from your SBomb listing all the objects that are contained in a software object have been vetted through, the NVD or MITRE, whoever you trust to provide you insights into vulnerabilities. So all of these input channels need to come together to raise the level of trust that you can use to determine if indeed an object is trustworthy enough to be installed in your critical systems. So some of the risks that we see within software objects, of course, is embedded malware, like you saw from the HackerOne framework, vulnerabilities and exploits, fakes, backdoors, third-party embedded objects, these are open source, external dependencies like web APIs, and I'm sure there are more we'll discover in time. So I mentioned value at risk in the analogy, and it is vitally important for us to, identify what that real value at risk is. If the maximum value at risk was just a spare tire, then you might not have too much of a concern. But if the value at risk is that your entire company gets shut down because of a malware incursion, and you're down for a week, like has occurred in certain companies, then your value at risk is significantly higher. And I've seen also credit rating agencies are beginning to factor in cybersecurity controls in their GRC assessments. And one group in particular that I hadn't presented some information to is the Moody's teammate, cyber assessment startup, Derek Vidala, and those guys are working on means to improve the timeliness and accuracy of information into their risk assessments and credit rating scores. And board of directors and executives care deeply about credit ratings. This determines how much it costs them to borrow money. So it can have some pretty significant financial impacts. And there's just a couple of breaches just to give you a sense of what it can cost. The Norsk Hydro incursion was estimated to cost between 64 and 76 million, and Maersk, the shipping company, was hit with a NotPetya attack, and they ended up having to rebuild a whole bunch of their systems at a cost of about $300 million. And there are some realities that we also want to keep in mind. Is that some people believe that cyber insurance is all it takes to put you in the right light, and reality is that cyber insurance doesn't always cover all of the risk. So here's a recent article from Bloomberg in July of 2020 that refers to the hydro attack, the Norsk hydro attack. And they said, as you see there, in the end, the attack would cost the company more than $60 million, way more than the $3.6 million the insurance policy has paid out so far, according to an earnings report. So, you know, buying cyber insurance is a hedge against financial costs, but it won't address some of the bigger headaches that you'll have to deal with, like having to rebuild servers and flush out, you know, all of the nefarious software that may be in your systems. So let me go through the 7 best practice software risk assessment steps that have been identified and that I present here. These risk assessment steps have been implemented in a software package that is available from my company, Reliable Energy Analytics. So it basically does the following for you. It performs an introspection of software objects looking for risk. This is the SBomb piece of the pie. We verify download server source location and certificates, perform virus scans of known malware, verify digital signatures, perform vulnerability searches, perform vendor verification using available data. We also perform man-in-the-middle attack checks to see if there's any foreign influence or blacklisted sites in the path that could perform a man-in-the-middle incursion. And ultimately, when all of these steps are completed, we create a trustworthiness score based on that risk assessment. And lastly, all of the material is saved in a results file, an evidence file, if you will, that can be presented to auditors coming in from NERC or FERC, or could even be presented to the folks at a credit rating agency as evidence that a party is indeed implementing their controls to prevent bad software from making its way into the systems. So software introspection, everything has to start with knowing what's in the software. And so after acquiring an object, it's important to perform a deep inspection. In an ideal case, a vendor would supply you with a software bill of materials. I'm going to go a little bit into that in a moment. But in many cases today, the software bill of materials isn't provided, so you have to essentially examine the software in a way that enables you to identify what's in the package as best you can. And you can think of this SBOM it's sort of like an FDA food label. So you can imagine if you were allergic to peanuts, you'd want to know what's in the food you're about to purchase at the store to see if there's any risk. And it's the same concept here with the software bill of materials of any software object that you're contemplating installing in your ecosystem. So you definitely want to know what's in there in case there's anything bad that you need to be aware of. You want to identify the manufacturer, of course, and the developer of the software, determine the name of the product associated with the software along with the version, and verify that the developer and product information match the information that you acquired when you started your procurement discussions with the vendor. So you're going to want to capture some information from the vendor when you are before you actually sign the contract. You're going to want to know, give me information about what digital certificate you will use to sign the objects, and tell me where the source location is that I can always, that's the trusted source location. So you need to get a good bit of information from the vendor beforehand, which you use in corroborating the evidence. So what's an SBomb? So an SBomb is essentially a nested inventory. And the fine folks working over at the Department of Commerce, NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, have been working on this challenge for a couple of years now. And what they've got is essentially a core set of common concepts or terms that should exist within any SBOM. And right now there are a few SBOM formats, standards, if you will, that exist, and NTIA is working to reconcile that into some common, set of terms that every SBOM shouldn't in fact contain. And of course, along with that are the semantics of what those individual items mean. Like you look on the screen there, I show you supplier name. What exactly is that? And so the SBOM standards would go into some level of depth and say that this is like a legal name of a party, as opposed to just like an acronym. It's like it wouldn't be IBM, it would be International Business Machines Incorporated, as an example. So SBOMs are becoming a very important part of the risk assessment equation. And one important format that I'll mention here, because of the connection to the OWASP community, is that OWASP does indeed have a very fine SBOM format and standard. And the slides that I'm sharing with you here today come from Steve Springett. And Steve is he's sort of the high priest of the Cyclone DX world. But he's very involved in OWASP in a number of different areas, and he provided these, so I want to thank Steve for that. As you can see here, he gives a little bit of history about where Cyclone DX came from. It started with the OS dependency tracker, and we're now at Cyclone DX version 1.2. I believe they're getting close to 1.3, so we may see that before the end of the year. I'm not entirely sure, but I know they're working on it. Okay, and so and you see there down below, I tell you about all of Steve's credentials. He's the real McCoy. He's the guy that knows Cyclone DX better than anyone on the planet. So he'd be the guy to go to. This is sort of motherhood and apple pie, but it's worth stating is that this is what their design approach was. Is they wanted it to be easy to adopt. And they wanted this SBOM, the Cyclone DX SBOM, to help you in identifying risks to as many adopters as possible and as quickly as possible. So risk assessments was front and center when Steve and company were creating the Cyclone DX SBOM. And there are other uses as well, but anyway, they want to also avoid any and all blockers that prevent the identification of risk. Continuous improvement is one of their key philosophies. They encourage innovation. They try to be backwards compatible, and from what I've seen, they are achieving that. They look for facts. That's key. That's a key component of their philosophy, and it's full stack SBOM. So what that means is if you have a software package that was written in Python and it relies on some Python packages, Cyclone DX is a rich enough taxonomy to be able to define all those, those platform level dependencies. So it is a very robust language for describing software bill of materials. So some of the use cases for SBOM and Cyclone DX in particular is to describe a complete and accurate inventory of your software, identify security vulnerabilities, integrity verification, software package evaluation. A big one is also license identification and asset management. Parties run afoul of some of their licenses. Some open source software licenses can be problematic, and so knowing about those is important to know where your risks are. And of course, it describes some of the complexities of some of these projects. I've seen some packages with literally thousands of objects embedded in it. Node.js is a great example of one of those. It also shows this component pedigree, and there's an element of provenance as well that's being captured. And it also shows you any reliance on services. This is really important. A lot of software objects today or applications rely on external web services, and knowing that you have those dependencies in an application is critical. You need to know if those dependencies, if those web services go away, your software may not work. So it's important to know that you have those dependencies. And there are a bunch of SBOM examples. I'll just point you to them. This is the link to the SBOM examples site on GitHub for Cyclone DX. I encourage you to go there. It's quite daunting, though. These can be really, really large and complicated looking because many times these software packages do include quite a number of objects that need to be described. Okay, so you also need to verify that source location and the vendor. So you always want to parse the SSL digital certificate for identification information. Is the issuing CA performing thorough investigations of identity before issuing the certificate? Some people, create self-signed certificates, and they use those for their SSL connections and or servers and web servers. And candidly, there's really no trust. You really need to have a trusted third party. And in the case of the energy industry, we have a set of what we call accredited certificate authorities. And these are CAs that have taken on an additional level of diligence and completing the requirements of the energy industry, which are quite, more rigorous than, many industries, many, cases where people are using certificates. The energy industry only has a handful of these accredited CAs, but they're vital to ensuring that the right or the authorized party is accessing the servers and systems that are used to run the electric system. So you also want to verify the validity of the digital certificate, confirm that the vendor and source location match what was given to you during your procurement discussion. So this again goes back to the corroborating evidence to ensure that you can trust an object before installing it. And any source locations that lack SSL digital certificates should never be trusted. So that's a red flag right out of the chute. And you really need to be very selective when choosing a CA. This is why in the energy industry, we identify only a handful that are accredited because they are agreeing to some very rigid requirements that like they would never get away with doing what's being done here. You've got less than 42 hours to regenerate your certs. There are provisions in those accreditation standards that would, that would require that they work with the companies in the energy industry to agree on some reasonable time frame to address any issues. You just can't shut down the electric system. So, if your cert is all of a sudden revoked, and you can't, schedule your electricity across a circuit, there are worse things that can happen. So malware and vulnerabilities, I call these out because I've heard some people kind of use them interchangeably, and they're really very different. So malware is really a deliberate attempt by a hacker to implant software in a victim's computing ecosystem in order to gain a foothold or perform various nefarious acts like ransomware. And you can see a few listed there. There's just so many, I couldn't even list them all. So malware is different from vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities are unintentional software imperfections which a hacker uses to access a victim's computing ecosystem using known exploits in order to gain a foothold to nefarious acts. Now, this is obviously a gray area, and I will say that any party that installs a backdoor, I would say, is actually installing a vulnerability. And we see this happen occasionally, actually more than we should, I think. where a vendor will put in a backdoor so that their support staff can get access to whatever they need to in order to carry out a support function. And so those sort of fall into, I would put those in the vulnerabilities area just because they are exploitable. And vulnerabilities and exploits are often used to implement malware. So these are not mutually exclusive concepts. One can be used to leverage the other. So that's another way to think about this. So what do you do in your software risk assessment? Well, you got to perform a malware scan using trusted and up-to-date antivirus software. And any discovered malware automatically results in a trust score of 0. You perform a search for known vulnerabilities and exploits using some of the, using the well-known sources of this, like MITRE CVE and NIST NVD. I did make a proposal to the folks at Rapid7 to improve their attacker KB search results by aligning some of the metadata with what's being discussed in SBomb standardization. So ideally someday what I'd like to do is get to the point where I can submit an SBomb to a CVE vendor service and have a complete report come back that lists all the vulnerabilities for each of the components within that bill of materials. That would save me a tremendous amount of work, and it would also improve the quality of the results. The results coming back from the CVE databases today is very, very noisy. And so it'd be great if we could find a way to improve the signal to noise ratio and have less false positives coming out of those systems. And just in terms of the antivirus, my software, sagpm, uses VirusTotal because it is an ensemble of virus scanners that, it's better to have one voice, one set of eyes looking at, have a multiple set of eyes looking at for risks, and that has proven to be very valuable to me. And of course, any discovered malware or vulnerability risk results in a trust score of 0. Software object provenance. Here again, I mentioned you got to look for man-in-the-middle attacks and foreign influence, and blacklisted IPs are a great example. And so, in my case, the software identifies any foreign presence in the path used to acquire a software object. Also have to verify the digital signature, looking for any indication of expired certificates. That would be a red flag. Also want to look at the freshness of the digital certificate. If it's too old, then the software object may not be trustworthy because things happen over time, and new vulnerabilities are discovered all the time. In fact, I saw a paper just last week where it's called "Catch Me If You Can," and it was the best paper award at the ACM conference on CPS and IoT cybersecurity. That was on November 9th. And they said that in their analysis, and they looked at empirical data, that the average vulnerability operates in the wild for about 5.2 years. That's a lot of risk. So, this is another case where, you could have a digital signature from, 10 years ago, but there's a vulnerability that could still exist there. So lack of a digital certificate over a software object is also reason to reduce trust to 0. Some people have said, well, you can use a hash value, and that's true. You can use a hash value to verify integrity, but the hash has no real application in terms of identity and authentication. So here are some of the very real experiences I've had as I've been operating, maintaining and managing the sagpm software now for about a year. Bad SSL certs have been encountered. Untrustworthy SSL certs. Litzencrypt is a great example of one. And their certificate signing practice makes this very clear. They don't really do any authentication at all, a verification of one's identity. It is purely to ensure that an encrypted channel can be established. And in their case, they ended up, they issued a bunch of certs without verifying the CA authorization field in the DNS domain. So they had a little over 3 million certificates that they had to revoke because of that fact. So you really want to be very careful in who you select for CA. And this is one of the reasons why the energy industry specifically has accredited those few who pass the test. Like, they're like the Navy SEALs, or the Green Berets. These are the best of the best, and they support the energy industry, and we appreciate what they do. So here's another case. Here's a case where, and this is a screenshot from SAGPM, where this was a software object was submitted to VirusTotal, and VirusTotal came back and reported specific specific results of malware, presence of software or objects that could be potentially be harmful. And in some cases, in the next blocks down, you see in some cases only one of the available engines, in this case 73 engines that examined an object, was able to identify a potential risk. So having the ensemble of virus scanning engines look at these software objects is much better than having a single object, a single virus scanner, which may or may not have the most up-to-date signatures at their disposal. Digital risk, signature risk, as I mentioned, the ASUS incursion was one where they were using, the hackers were using an actual certificate from ASUS, an older certificate that was no longer used, but it was still valid. And so here's a case where, we want to identify if there are any expired certs in a signature chain. And you also want to examine the freshness of the signature. Here down below, you see where I have the warning. It says this signature is more than 1 year in the past. And you can see that's from 2011, that signature. So 9 years have passed since the software object that was signed with this certificate was placed into service. So a lot could have happened in those 9 years. Vulnerabilities and exploits, and one of our premier software vendors is OSIsoft, and manufacturers use OSIsoft as well. They have a Historian product that it's the cream of the crop. And I'm not picking on OSIsoft here. OSIsoft is a very proficient software vendor, and they take extremes to ensure that their software is secure. But even they can be, caught up in some vulnerabilities that might exist, and they can happen they can be simple. A buffer overflow can be easily implemented by a young programmer who may not have, be aware of the need to, check for buffer overflow. So, and so even the best vendors can be subject to this issue. Provenance, I've already mentioned, is here I show you a case where this is an example of a site in Iran. That's the IR you see on the DNS blacklist, and you see it's a blacklisted site and it's outside the United States. In this case, it's in Iran. So this would immediately reduce the trust level in the trust score that SAGPM will create. And of course, watering holes. WordPress is a great example. They have GitHub, of course, is well known for, providing lots of software, but it's all over the place. WordPress is another one of those sites that has tons of software available. And spoofed software locations. The NSO group from Israel is very famous for having created impersonating Facebook and providing downloads to software for cell phones that could be used to extract some sensitive information. So That's an example of a nation state and firm doing work on behalf of a nation state, actually. Some of the common misconceptions about software is that a verified digitally signed software object is always trustworthy, and it's just simply not true. The digitally signed software objects are a veil of trust that may not be justified. And you can see I have a few examples here for you, like Authenticode certificates are a great example. People think that if they have an Authenticode signed object or Authenticode certificate signed object, that it's completely trustworthy to be installed. And that is absolutely not the case. You can get an Authenticode certificate from, from a number of different vendors. I think DigiCert is one, and it's only about $500. So it doesn't take a lot of resources to get a Authenticode certificate. Software vendors always patch known vulnerabilities immediately, and this is absolutely not the case. And this was from a posting in May of 2020, where Microsoft was issuing fixes to vulnerabilities from 1996. And of course, the paper I cited earlier, which was created by the folks at the University of Bristol and the University of Birmingham in the UK, it's called Catch Me If You Can, and it's got a long title, but it goes into some really good details about what they found about problems with CVEs and how long vulnerabilities can exist in the wild. And as I mentioned, they found that on average it's 5.2 years that a vulnerability can be out there and exposed and potentially exploited. All vendors follow secure coding standards, and that is definitely not true. And here's a paper from NIST that talks about, what you should look for in a software development lifecycle that has secure software development framework built into the process. So if you're curious about that, the NIST paper is available for you to look at. And that was just released in April of this year. Okay, we're getting close to the end. The real bottom line here is you must protect yourself. You cannot be assured that a vendor is aware of the risks that are inherent in their software or the supply chain used by your company to acquire their software. I've fat-fingered a number of URLs and brought me to places I just didn't want to be. And if you did that and downloaded software, then you may not be happy with the object you're about to install. So it's easy enough to happen. You got to have controls in place to ensure that those things aren't happening to you. And if a breach does occur in your company, then you will be the one accountable for the damage and cost to recover, not the software vendor or the supplier, or along with any other non-compliance fines, which are quite common in the electric industry. And you can't outsource all of the costs of a breach, like to a cyber insurance company. It just it's not possible. You will be on the hook for recovery efforts and the harm to your reputation from a successful cyber attack on your company. But you can try to detect these risks, and that's what this 7-step risk assessment software, software supply chain risk assessment is all about. And I'm a father of 2 daughters, so this next one is, I try to warn them about taking a drink from a stranger in a bar, and software should be viewed in the same way. Don't just guzzle that drink away. You just need to, implement or apply some due diligence and run a software risk assessment before you think about installing it anywhere. And my tagline is you never trust software, always verify and report. And of course, this is not a one and done deal. Vulnerabilities can be discovered on a regular basis and usually are. So once you've done that first risk assessment, it's imperative that any software you do install, that you have a constant monitoring feature or function to ensure that no new vulnerabilities have been identified. So on a regular basis, whether it's nightly or, at least once a day, I would recommend go through and have sagpm, so you can automate the script and have it go through all the existing installed software and check for just vulnerabilities to see if there are any new ones. So, wrapping up, software supply chain breaches are costly to recover from and can adversely affect your company's finances and reputation and your own career. So apply prudent risk management controls following the NIST Cybersecurity Framework best practices to detect these risks. And no risk management control is guaranteed to protect you from harm, but some are useful. And sagpm is I keep improving it in order to make sure that it continually keeping up to date with new changes and improvements in best practice and so forth. So it is a constant effort. So your software supply chain risk assessment should include really both a vendor-centric assessment as well as a software-centric risk assessment. And you can't rely on vendors to protect you from harm. So this is a great case. I got this from SANS in one of their use cases. This is actually what happened in this with the Ukraine electric system, which we all know is well-known, had a well-known blackout occur and from a NotPetya attack. And before they were attacked, you can see their risk ranking on the left. It was based on following factors. Our organization doesn't use these protocols, or the organization doesn't use vendor products, and so on and so forth. And the reality is, as you can see on the right there, the reality is that they were indeed vulnerable. And so they elevated their risk assessment into the red zone. Let me hold that. I just do want to acknowledge Tom Ulrich, who helped me with some of the CIP-13 materials. And this is a little bit of information about my company, Reliable Energy Analytics. We're located in Westfield, Massachusetts. So we're right up the street from our friends in Connecticut who are hopefully watching this. And as I said, we do have patent pending Software Assurance Guardian Point Man, or SAG-PM. As I mentioned, I do a lot of work in the energy industry, and I worked with ISO New England to develop their advanced data analytics solutions as well, and the PKI implementation. Okay, so there's my contact information, and I'm going to try and make my way back to the track here. Okay, I don't see any questions. Are there any questions for me? Okay. I know I went through that pretty quickly, but as I said at the beginning, I recognize that I'm the only thing between you and the rest of your weekend. So I hope that you got something useful out of it. And if anyone has any, anything they'd like to, they're welcome to contact me. I'll put my email here if you really want to get in touch with me. All right, let me stop screen sharing first. Okay. I think I stopped screen sharing. At least I hope I have. Doesn't look it, yeah. Okay. Okay, for some reason it seems my screen is freezing up on me here. Let me try it this way. Let's get out of it that way. Let's see if that helps. Okay. Okay.
All right, I was on mute there. All right, it looks like there you are, Dick.
I'm back. Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, do you have anything else to say, or we can get started with the closing remarks for the?
No, I think that covers it. I know this was energy industry specific, but you know, some of the concepts should be of use to others as well. So hopefully you found some value.
Yeah, definitely. Installing other people's software that you don't know who belongs to. So valuable lesson.
Yeah.
I've definitely been burned by that one, and I'm sure many other people have as well. All right. Well, thank you, Dick, for that talk. That was very interesting, especially to see on the energy sector side. I'm glad to see somebody's protecting our energy grid over here. Hopefully we don't.
Lots and lots of people.
Yeah. Hopefully we don't end up like the Ukrainians there with forced blackouts and whatnot.
Yeah, well, you know, there's been a lot of interest, you know, in the energy industry. We had a transformer that was absconded as it was en route to its eventual party because there was concern of foreign influence and risk associated with it. So you just everyone's on the edge trying to ensure that we're not going to become a victim.
Yeah. Physical supply chain. Gotcha. Makes sense.
And the cyber supply chain, another factor too, is huge. Just enormous.
Awesome. Well, if anybody else has any questions for Dick, feel free to post them in the Discord. I imagine, Dick, you're in there, and we can continue the conversation on there.